gonna be ready to go. Okay, here we go. So hi, my name is Bob Hummer. I'm a fellow here at the Carolina Population Center. I'm ready to start today's Friday seminar. We are thrilled to have with us Ashu Handa, one of our own. As everybody knows, I'm sure, Ashu is the keen eminent professor in the Department of Public Policy here at CPC and a longtime fellow of the Carolina Population Center. Ashu is an economist. He works on poverty, health, and human development in sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps most interestingly and important for today, he's co-PI of the Transfer Project, and it's one of our major projects here at CPC, and it's a regional initiative with UNICEF and FAO, and it understands the broad effects of government-sponsored cash transfer programs in sub-Saharan Africa. He's currently funded by the Hewlett Foundation, the National Institute on Aging, and Settle for pieces of this project. And today's talk is going to focus on Malawi's social cash transfer program. So I'll turn it over to Ashu. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat. And otherwise, when he's finished talking, he'll be able to handle Q&A for people just raising their hands or just asking a question. But if you have something along the way, feel free to put it in the chat and I'll try to ask him to respond to those. So Ashu, please take it away. Thank you for coming, and we're thrilled to have you today.
Thanks a lot for that, Bob. Thanks for having me. What I'm going to present is really the the effort of a really large team. Some of the folks couldn't make it today. Some are on here. I want to, in particular, so Carolyn Halpern is one of the co-Is, as is Alison Aiello and Gustavo Angeles, Claire Barrington. Susana Fajardo is here. She's our project manager, makes everything happen. Paul Sirma is a PhD student working with these data, and Juba Kafumba is here. Oh, there you are, Juba. Juba is also a PhD student working on this project, and in fact, she was with us doing the field work in Malawi earlier this year. So I just wanted you to at least be able to match the names with the faces in case you run into these folks anywhere. Okay, so let me try and share my screen here. Oops. How embarrassing is that? Okay. What I'm going to aim for is to leave quite a bit of time for discussion and questions, all right? Because some of the subject matter here might be new to people, and there might be some interest in finding out more. So I'm ultimately going to talk about the government of Malawi's social cash transfer program. But before I do that, so this is sort of the game plan for today. Before I do that, I wanted to step back for a minute and just talk about what we refer to as the quiet revolution, which is the fact that cash transfers are really spreading like wildfire as a major, poverty tool for governments in Africa, but actually throughout the world. Okay, so let's just take stock of that for a second. Then we'll do a deep dive into the Malawi program in particular. I'll start off with the initial evaluation that we did in 2013, 2015. Let me see if I can get the laser going here. And then I'll tell you about the current study where we're doing this sort of long-term follow-up of the cohort that we studied back then, and we'll show you some preliminary results from that. Okay, and there are a number of interesting things that are coming out of those results, so I think it might be food for discussion. So let's start with just thinking about what I call the quiet revolution. And this is a poster in downtown Lusaka around the election in 2016. And here you can see Edward Lungu, who actually won that election, even though he recently just lost an election. But at the time, you can see that in this billboard, he is, one of the major platforms for Lungu was that he was going to expand the national cash transfer program called, referred to as social welfare or the social cash transfer program. We have seen this in several other countries where you have competitive elections, including recently Malawi had an election in which the the president or the person running for office had pledged to maintain the social cash transfer. In Ghana, the program has survived several transfers of power, and it's always been an integral part of the platform. In Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta had promised to expand the national cash transfer program. So this is quite interesting from a political economy point of view, but these programs are of great interest, not just to development specialists, but also to politicians, right? So let's step back a bit. So I want to focus particularly on unconditional cash transfer programs. What are these? These are regular, predictable transfers that are designed to support vulnerable groups. They're unconditional, so there are no behavioral conditions. The closest that we come in the US to something like this is the TANF program. That, of course, does have conditions in terms of work or training and so on. So we don't really have maybe the WIC program might be similar, but that also has some conditions, and of course it's tied right to food and nutrition. Worldwide, the World Bank estimates that over 800 million people are enrolled in some kind of cash transfer. In sub-Saharan Africa in particular, there's just been an explosion recently. So you can see that even in the last decade, we've gone from just 21 to 44, and actually this number is even higher now in terms of the number of countries. And remember, what I'm talking about governments. I'm not talking about nonprofits and other things, right? These are actually governments who are implementing large-scale programs. In the transfer project, we estimate about 80 million people are being reached. Of course, the largest suite of programs is in South Africa, where about 20 million people are reached. And of course, you may have heard of the Child Support Grant, which is the single largest program in South Africa, which is basically a grant for all kids who are living in poverty up to the age of 18. We have generated through us and our partners, tons of evidence on the impacts of these programs, and there's our website if you want to explore some more. So what are the basic features of the programs in Africa? They target on poverty and vulnerability. Okay, the programs, particularly around the mid-2000s, the HIV/AIDS was a big driver for these programs, right? And so as a result, coming out of that was sort of an emphasis on trying to capture orphans and vulnerable children and setting up targeting mechanisms to capture households that had essentially suffered a prime age death in the family, right? And you still see the legacy of that initial kind of focus in some of the programs today. Beneficiaries tend to be, by and large, paid in cash. We call that a pull system, where beneficiaries are pulled into a pay point to receive their transfer. We're talking about $10 to $20 per month, depending on the country. Sometimes it's a flat transfer. Sometimes the transfer increases with household size. In just a few countries can we say that the programs are fully at scale, all right? So the countries I've listed here have very large programs in terms of proportion of the population, but they're not fully at scale, okay? So that's kind of the essentials of it. Here's a photo of the pay point in the Malawi cash transfer program. And as you can see, it's this pull system. So there's a advertised payday, and recipients or beneficiaries are pulled in to a particular place in the center of the village or village cluster. And, they've got their ID cards and so on. You can see the demographic profile here. So you've got the men here, the women here. These tend to be elderly, okay? So they're typically aunties or grandmas taking care of orphans, right? Couple more kind of illustrations of what we're talking about in these pull systems. So here's the Ghana LEAP, also an unconditional cash transfer program. This is, again, the Malawi program. You can see that, beneficiaries, by and large, have very little literacy or numeracy. So you can see instead of signing, you're providing a thumbprint here. You see the thumbprints here. There's the cash. Okay. And if you're interested in these programs, I've sort of highlighted here programs where there's a lot of action. And by action, I mean that there is dynamism. The programs are expanding. They're really thinking about their targeting. They're really thinking about, so that there's a lot of activity in the sector. And so those would be Malawi, Zambia, Ghana, Tanzania, that have had rapid scale up. I should also circle Kenya as well. Okay, but other countries are also, virtually all governments have a type of unconditional cash transfer at this point in Africa. As we study these programs, from their infancy, 100,000 households seems to be a critical threshold. Once the government reaches that threshold, it seems very hard to turn back the clock. There are just so many beneficiaries on the rolls. The program is large. There's a large administrative system to support it, that it becomes very hard to think that that program will subsequently be closed down. As I mentioned, targeting tends to be rather unique. It's poverty targeted, but also targeted on demographic structure. And again, that comes out of this sort of focus on protecting families that were AIDS affected, that potentially had a prime age adult who had died of AIDS. And so here I'm showing you the kind of age profile of beneficiaries across 4 programs, right? And you can see that there are lots of youth, right? So this is the OVC group. There are very few prime age adults. And then there's a little bit of a jump here, and these are the elderly caregivers, so either aunts or grandmas and so on, right? And so we refer to these as sort of missing generation households, okay? And so this is fairly typical, and particularly in many of the Southern African countries where HIV/AIDS was a major concern, right? If you compare that profile with like the typical profile of poor households in sub-Saharan Africa, your typical poor household or ultra-poor household has a very young age structure. They have lots of young kids, okay? And it's young people, and they have very few elderly. Compared to beneficiaries of some of these programs, which sort of pick a kind of unique set of households from this group. And you can see, how unique they are based on kind of the criteria of either, dependency ratio or labor constraints or whatever the way they choose to do the targeting. So that's something that's worth thinking about when we highlight some of the impacts, right? Because when we highlight some of the impacts, we should think back to, well, what kind of households these are, okay? In particular, when we think about the productive impacts, if you look at these type of households, you have to wonder, well, how can this household generate productive impacts? Who are the workers, right? There was a podcast on NPR that sort of cited our work on the Zambia programs, and in that podcast, you could look it up and have a listen or read the transcript. But it really highlighted one of the key, the key tension among governments now with these programs, which is that they started off quite narrowly targeted, based on, as I said, typically HIV/AIDS concerns. But as they become larger, the question is, where do we go from here, right? And so governments are kind of struggling a little bit with that. And this podcast really highlights that issue. And in particular, the issue is, are governments ready to make the transition into like a comprehensive, social protection system, based on categorical targeting, or do they just want to continue with these very narrowly focused programs, right? And which countries, South Africa has made the transition. The southern, Namibia, Botswana, they've made the transition. But other countries like Zambia and Ghana are still kind of struggling with this. And one of the key underlying things is, the idea of protection versus production and growth. And the idea is that, well, we want to spend our money to enhance economic growth, and social protection may not do that. So those are kind of the tensions that are coming out. We'll get back to those. If you're interested in no strings cash, right, there are two pretty interesting experiments that are going on in the United States, and you can, look those up and see what they're up to. I've given you some of the parameters, but one is this Compton Pledge in the city of Compton, Southern California, and then this Open Research Lab is conducting its own experiment. So there's a lot of interest in, the universal basic income right now. Okay, let's take a look at the time, 12:15. Have a quick sip of water. All right, let's do a little deeper dive into the Malawi program in particular now. So the Malawi program is pretty big, right? It covers about 8% of the population. But currently, it's one of the programs that is, precarious in the sense that its funding is primarily through foreign aid, as opposed to, say, neighboring Zambia. In Zambia, most of the funding of the program, which also reaches about 8%, is out of taxpayers' money through Treasury, right? So you may look from the outside at the Malawi and Zambian programs, and on the surface, you would think, oh, these are the same, right? Coverage, parameters, benefit levels. But there's a very big difference, which is that in Malawi, it's really donor finance. In Zambia, it isn't. Okay. In Malawi, the transfer varies by household size, up to a max of 4. There's a top-up for children of school-going age to encourage school enrollment, although the program is not conditional. The average transfer is about $12 per month. Okay. It's paid bi-monthly. I showed you some photos of the payment points. And when we did the initial evaluation, it represented about 18% of consumption. Okay. Now, due to inflation, the value of the transfer has gone down. It's closer to 12% now. Okay. It targets the ultra poor. Okay, so not folks below the poverty line, but folks below the ultra poverty line. Okay. These folks are living on about 30 US cents per person per day. So they are precisely, some of the poorest households in the world. We've been working with the government on this program for over a decade, and the evaluation results that we have been able to produce has really fed into policy discussions and program scale up and increasing the transfer size. We've done a lot of work to help make the case, for maintaining the value of the transfer. And now our work entails really reconsidering the targeting of the program as well. So that's ongoing. So we've really been quite involved in the Malawi program. Let me give you some of the design features of. I got to move my bar here. So let me talk about the 2013-2015 impact evaluation, and then I'll talk about the new long-term follow-up that's funded by NIH. So in that initial evaluation, we designed a cluster randomized control trial. We were able to do that because the government was expanding the program at that time in 2 districts, Salima and Mangochi. And so that meant that we could get a baseline. And it also meant that because it would take a while to scale up the program, it was possible to identify a delayed entry group, right? So that nobody would have to purposely sort of not be in the program if they would have normally, right? Because it takes a while to scale up, okay? And so it takes roughly 2 years to scale up entirely in a district. And so that basically gave us a 2-year window to conduct the evaluation. So that was sort of, the ethics behind the randomization and so on. So ultimately, we did the random selection of 2 traditional authorities in each district. So that's the random selection. These are the TAs. Okay, and then within TAs, we had the clusters, the village clusters, the VCs. And so within the TAs, then we randomly selected village clusters to be included. Ultimately, when we did the random assignment, these were the households in the two groups. Okay, we have, we have a picture, more or less. So these are that's Salima, the two TAs, Mangochi, the two TAs, treated, control. So you see they are in clusters. There are some neighboring treated and controlled clusters, so we have to be careful about that. And we did some stuff to check on possible spillovers. We also interviewed some ineligibles because we wanted to check on the targeting of the program. Okay. Now remember that this is for those, budding researchers who are all excited about doing your RCT. I want to remind you that this is a government program that we're evaluating, that governments, have responsibilities to their citizens. They have rules and, transparency is important. And so one of the key issues here was the random assignment to the treated or the delayed entry control arm. Now remember that, some village clusters we're going to have to wait no matter what, just because it takes a while to scale up in a district. So that some households and village clusters would not enter the program for 2 years no matter what. So what we said was, well, okay, let's randomly assign or randomly pick who those households or village clusters would be. And so that's the random assignment, okay? So that was done publicly. We created a list. We went to the district commissioner's office. We did the coin toss in public. We took the photos. We have the memos that we wrote to indicate, how the selection or the assignment was going to be. Essentially, we randomly ordered the village clusters, and then we kind of divided them into a top half and a bottom half. And we said to the district commissioner, okay, you tell me, is heads the treated or is heads the control? And the commissioner would, so that they would flip the coin, and then that's how we would just, figure out who was going in the treated and who was going in the control group. So again, this is not researchers sitting in their office at CPC at midnight, like deciding which households are going to, get this program first and not. All right. So when you're dealing with this kind of evaluation, this level of transparency is extremely important, right? So you have to be able to, the district commissioners, the social welfare officers who are in the field every day, they have to be able to explain, the rollout of the program and why the rollout is going in a certain way, okay? And for the social welfare officers, there's nothing better than to be able to say, well, it was done randomly. It was out of our hands and it was done randomly, okay? So you can imagine that this was also empowering for the frontline workers who are, dealing with prospective recipients. We could talk about, implementation issues around that if we like. Moving along. So data collection, pretty comprehensive. We had a multi-topic household survey modeled after the Malawi National Household Survey, the IHS. We had the full consumption module from the IHS. Okay, so we're talking about, over 300 individual consumption items like the bananas and the onions and the cassava and, the fried fish and everything is in there. We also did a little bit of innovative work around young people or youth. So we picked 3 adolescents or young people in the household, ages 13 to 19 at baseline, and we had direct face-to-face interviews with them to kind of understand their well-being. And so we gathered information on psychological well-being, on romantic partners, on sexual experiences, time preference, and other stuff. So that was an interesting kind of subsample that we also had. We had the community survey, and then Claire Barrington and Maxton, our collaborator in Malawi, led a qualitative component. That should be qualitative, not quantitative, And that was an embedded longitudinal design. Embedded meaning that from the quantitative household survey, we purposely selected, recipients and youth that we were going to have in-depth interviews with to try and understand how this program changed their lives. A lot of rich results from the qualitative work. Let's get into some of the results. So just some basic stuff. Everything I show you and most of the work that we've done is based on difference and differences with a sparse set of baseline covariates. We have a baseline at 2013, a 12-month follow-up, and then an additional 12-month follow-up in 2015. Okay, so we have 2 post-treatment survey waves. Attrition, as you can see, was pretty low at 6%. There was no differential attrition. The randomization was successful. Gustavo made us sleep at CPC until we basically tested balance on everything that we collected. What else? We have published lots of stuff on this work already. So what I want to maybe present to you today are just kind of the big highlights of the results, okay? So we can get into some big picture implications, because that's going to feed into what I'm going to show you on the longer term results, okay, from the data that we just collected. So the work has just been published in Development Policy Review. Essentially what we do is we take, we create like 8 domain indices, and I'll show you the domains. And these domain indices are built on a set of individual indicators in that particular domain. Okay, and we create these indices. They're all in z-scores. Okay, they're standardized units. And what we do is we standardize everything against the control group in that wave, right? So we take the control group, like at baseline, we take the control group mean and standard deviation, and then we standardize everything, treatment and control, against the control group mean and standard deviation. For the follow-up wave, same thing. We take the control group mean and standard deviation at the follow-up for every indicator, and then we standardize everything against that. Okay, and so that's a fairly standard way in public policy and economics to do these kind of things and show these results. Okay. The standardization is important because we're comparing, indicators that have different units, right? So we want to be able to sort of compare their effects. Okay. So our first incriminating photo. Does anyone recognize that white guy over there on the left? Oh, we have at least one person in the chat who recognized. Can we get anyone else out there? Anyone else recognize this guy?
You have to think maybe 45, 50 pounds lighter than that picture.
Oh yeah, a likely story. That's what I have to say. A very likely story. My theory is that Phil Morgan, who was the CPC director at the time, I think Phil didn't really trust us. He was suspicious of what we were doing over in Malawi. So he sent this person over to check up on us. That's my story. I'm sticking with it. Anyway, here's some other incriminating stuff. Essential material for enumerator training. This entire suitcase, checked baggage, is filled with candy, including, what are those things called, Tim?
The fireballs.
The fireballs, yes, the fireballs. We made all the enumerators taste the fireballs. That was something. And there are other maybe less important stuff, like these are the tablets, I think, right? And the cords and stuff. But anyway, okay, here we go. And this is Zomba, which is where the University of Malawi is. Okay, so here's the killer graph. Okay, so like I said, we have constructed these domains. The domains cover, both the protective side and the social side, and of course the productive side, right? And I'll show you the individual indicators in a second. But again, we for each indicator, we build a z-score, as I mentioned, and then we take the average of the z-score to build the overall domain index. All right. So these are the ITT, and the ITT is the same as the ATT in this case because everyone takes up the program. There's no crossover. You know, it's a pretty clean RCT here. So these are the difference in difference impacts, okay, in standard deviation units. Now, these are pretty tremendous, right? I mean, this is really incredible. In fact, as I'm going to show you some comparative, you know, results just for you to really appreciate that these are one of the largest set of, you know, impacts of a cash transfer ever like reported, okay? You know, let's take consumption, which is sort of like a lead indicator, okay? We're talking about a 0.5 standard deviation impact on consumption. Food security is even higher, 0.8 standard deviations impact. Assets, subjective well-being, income and revenue, big, but maybe just, you know, crossing zero, finance and debt just crossing zero. This finance and debt indicator, at the follow-up surveys, we added some additional indicators, the crucial one being savings, and there are big impacts on savings. So when we do a single difference estimate where we only look at the follow-up and use all the follow-up indicators, then you can see that we have big positive impacts. But that's driven by savings, although, you know, this is not too far off. Material needs of individual kids, school enrollment impacts are huge, but no impacts on very young kids on anthropometry. And if you remember the demographic composition of the households, there are very few kids in the 0 to 5 age range. We're powered to estimate a 0.2 standard deviation effect if it existed, but we didn't find any. That is not uncommon, actually. So that's our killer graph. Okay, so that's the one that you want to keep in mind, and that's the one that's in the Development Policy Review article. This graph is unreadable, of course, but I just wanted you to appreciate the fact that behind each of those domain indices are the individual indicators, right? And so here's sort of a list of the individual indicators. There are a couple of things here that I do want you to maybe remember or think about. You know, one is the savings. Okay, so this is savings, and you know, I mentioned these huge savings impacts. Look at those. Again, this is single difference, but it's an RCT. The design is good. The implementation is good. We've got baseline balance. So these are going to be causal, right? 0.8 standard deviations. That's humongous. Remember, these folks are living on 30 US cents per person per day, and yet they're getting some money and they're able to save a little bit or trying to save a little bit. So that already tells us something about what they view as important, right? Because this is no strings cash, it's unconditional. The other thing that I want you to look at is the assets, the productive assets, the livestock. Look at the livestock. That's huge, right? 0.7 standard deviations. Productive assets, we're talking about the hoe, the machete, you know, stuff like that. Pretty big impact. So, you know, folks are investing in productive stuff as well. It's not just consumption and food security. So that's quite important, right? If you remember how poor they are and what their demographic profile is. It's really quite amazing. And then the third thing I want you to look at is the school enrollment effects. Okay, so they're pretty big effects, you know, and they're particularly large for the secondary school age kids because that's where the dropout occurs. Okay, the dropout occurs after age 12 and 13 in the transition from primary to secondary, and that's precisely where you see the bigger effects. Okay, so those are the takeaways from there. And again, as I mentioned, you know, we've done some comparisons of these effects with other cash transfer programs, big ones, you know, like you know, everyone's heard of the Mexico Oportunidades, you've heard of the Colombia, you know, Familias en Acción. I mean, these are big programs, these are mature programs, right? They've been around for, you know, since the mid-90s. But look, I mean, the consumption effects in these three programs are equal to or much larger. Now, yes, the baseline is lower, but the transfer value is about the same. Actually, the transfer value is higher in Mexico and Colombia, right? So, just to say that these things are wildly successful. The other thing that I want you to maybe take away from this is, so there are big impacts on food security, obviously, consumption. Most of the consumption impacts are on food. Like I would say 75 to 80% of the total consumption impact is on food. Let's look at the foods. And again, remember, no strings cash. So we're getting an idea of what households value, right? Like in WIC and SNAP, we're kind of giving households a list in the US that these are only the things you can buy. Here, there's no list. You buy whatever you want. So what are you buying? So what I'm showing you here, and let's focus on the black versus the red. So the black is the baseline share of consumption that goes to that good. And I think this is food consumption. So it's the share of food consumption that goes to cereal at the baseline. Then what we've done is we've estimated how much of the consumption, how much of the transfer is spent on cereal, right? So, you can think about back in the day when you took Econ 101, there's the normal good and the luxury good and the staple good, right? Those are the income elasticities. So, this is basically a way of thinking about the income elasticity. But look, cereal is a staple. It's the first thing you eat. And so it's not surprising that, when you get a little extra money, you're maybe spending less of that on maize because you're already eating enough maize. So what are you going to spend the transfer on? Well, you're spending it on meat and poultry, right? So you can see that. The baseline share devoted to meat is down there, and then the end line share of the transfer that's devoted to meat is much higher, okay? Fat, sugar, spices, and actually this is driven by fat, by cooking oil, okay? So, imagine eating and, we all love the fried food, right? Well, guess what? We all love the fried food, and when you're very poor and can never have fried food, you have a little bit of money, you buy cooking oil, okay? And of course, we looked at things like alcohol and tobacco, and they take up such a puny share of the consumption that there's really not much action there. So from the qualitative work, Christina, to say the truth, things have changed. Our food consumption has changed. We're able to buy maize with the money and with the business running. We're also buy good relish, like fish, and we're able to buy salt. So relish is the side that you have with the shima, right? With the maize, with the cornmeal. Okay, so it's the side. How do you differentiate with before? There's a change. The kind of food is the same, yes, but maybe in the past we could just cook relish without tomatoes or oil. But now we are able to put oil, tomatoes, and the quality is better now. We would even lack salt and beg, which is not the same. Jafar, so again, we did IDIs with youth as well. Since the last time you got visited, has there been any change or improvement in your life? Remember, we visited them a baseline, and then we followed these same, respondents through the life of the survey. My life has changed. It has given me the encouragement on my school studies. Tell me more about this. Well, I used not to eat food in the morning, but now I do eat in the morning. Before, we lacked good quality food, but now we do eat fish, beans, and good vegetables. Is there any other food that you're managing to eat now? We're managing to eat goat meat now. Hallelujah. May everybody be able to afford to eat goat meat. That's my position. Okay. Let me step back for a sec, looking at the time here. Okay. Running out of time. Our survey instrument was so comprehensive that we tracked the spending in every corner of the survey instrument. We calculated, the amount spent, like just the total spending. This is not consumption, it's just total spending, right? So it's spending on agricultural items, it's spending on schools fees, it's spending on, and we compared the spending to the value of the transfer. Okay? And guess what? We discovered a multiplier, and we'd actually discovered a multiplier in the Zambia evaluations that we did as well. That is to say that it seemed after a few years, households were spending more than the value of the transfer they were receiving. So they were generating a multiplier. In Malawi, that multiplier is around 2.94, so almost 3 times. Okay, and that's the confidence interval. We'd also done similar exercise in Ghana and Zimbabwe. They're here. I won't focus. They're also above 1. Okay, but this Malawi's multiplier is pretty big. In Zambia, it was 1.8, and also confidence interval not including 0. So, what are these households doing? They are moving into livestock. So, this gives you an idea. This is the control group, the treatment group. This is in the post-intervention period. Everyone is doing agriculture. Everyone is doing casual labor. They're moving into livestock. They're moving into cash cropping. They're moving into non-farm enterprise. And they are more likely to send people for long-distance migration. This is one of the most popular non-farm enterprises. Do you know what it is? Anyone out there want to take a guess?
Charcoal?
It is, what did you say?
Making charcoal.
It's not making charcoal, but making charcoal is also a popular non-farm enterprise. This is home brewing. This is home breweries. Okay, basically you take the maize, the bad maize and the husks and stuff, and you ferment that, and you make beer or whatever it's called. Some more photos. We have impacts on youth. I don't want to talk about those. I want to talk about the follow-up. We went back to these households in 2021. Okay? And I wanted to talk a little bit, because we have a lot of students here, about how this all happened. How it happened is that Barbara Entwistle forced me and Alison Ayala to go have coffee and produce a PowerPoint for CPC on how we might collaborate. So we went off and had coffee, and we came up with this big idea based on, what Alison does, what I do, how we put the two together. We immediately said, what the heck, and we submitted an R21, got a decent score, but was not funded. We then said, what the heck again, and we went for a full-blown R01, got a 32nd percentile the first time, we resubmitted, and we got it funded. So the moral of this story is, when Barbara Entwistle suggests you have coffee with someone, you should go have coffee with that person. Okay? Now, Alison may not feel that way. You notice she isn't here today, so you may want to ask her separately how she feels about this. Listen, given the time, I want to just give you the big picture of what we're finding in the follow-up. Okay? So remember, the delayed entry group is delayed by about 30 to 33 months. Okay, and so after that, they started receiving cash. So around 2016, they started receiving cash. We go back in 2021, right? So the original control group between 2016 and 2021, so have 5 years of cash, whereas the original treatment group have about 7 or 7.5 years of cash. Is there a dosage effect? Did those who get cash earlier somehow have a permanent increase? So we've got some details. Attrition is good. We collected blood spots, but let's get to the highlights. Well, here's some fieldwork photos, just to give you an appreciation. This is the dried blood spots. We've got an innovation brief coming that we'll discuss those in a bit. Here we're collecting blood spots. So here are kind of some of the highlights of what we're finding. And just to give you a punchline here, we're finding that the control group is completely caught up to the treated group, completely. So, for example, here's consumption. So this is these are in actual units now, okay, because we're still analyzing the data. But, this is the 2015 impact on consumption, right? About 13,000 kwacha. That's the orange. This is now the impact between the treated and control in 2021. And you could see that it's, well, a little bit positive, but big confidence interval. Same with food. Confidence interval crossing zero. No significant difference anymore between the treated and the control. We look at subjective well-being, focusing on the green. Confidence interval crossing zero. Stress, crossing zero. Future expectations, crossing zero. And all of these were statistically significant program effects in 2015. It's full catch-up. How about the productive side? Crop selling, no impacts anymore. Own any asset, no impacts. Purchased asset, no impacts. Okay, and so on and so forth. I really need to close up, right? Same with schooling, no impacts. Paul Sirma is doing a deep dive for his dissertation. He's finding some impacts in some age groups on grade attainment. But what's the main message so far? There's a complete catch-up. There's no dosage effect of this program. Okay? How is that, Ashu? You just told me there was a multiplier. How do we square this multiplier effect with this complete catch-up? And we believe the answer is that these households are so poor that even if you're multiplying, you're starting off at 30 cents per day. If you double that, you get to 60 cents per day. That's hardly middle class. Folks are still below the national poverty line. So it's still a very precarious existence. It's not like people are being shifted, out and into the middle class and are completely shifting out of agriculture, completely moving into a whole new sector. They're still doing what they can with the limited amount they have. They're just able to do a little bit more because they can buy some fertilizer, they can hire some labor, and that goes a long way, but it's not a permanent graduation out of poverty. And really that's the punchline, which is that, this idea of graduation from poverty is like the new development buzz phrase. How do we graduate people out? And the World Bank has partnered with this NGO BRAC in Bangladesh, and they've got this, program that they're trying to push everywhere, which is a graduation program. This multifaceted program. You give an unconditional transfer, you give an asset transfer, you do some hand holding, and this is thought to be able to get people permanently out of poverty. And the problem is that these social protection programs are not graduation programs. They're actually choosing the most vulnerable folks and giving them a little cash to survive. And so, in some sense, the folks who are using the graduation buzzword are kind of hijacking these programs and comparing them to something for which, that was not their objective. And so I think we've been very excited about the productive effects of these social protection programs, and we've forgotten that actually their job is protection and not production. So I'm going to stop there, and I apologize that I didn't leave very much time for discussion, Bob. But we can open it up now, see what people have to say. If there are more questions, or maybe people have answers for our puzzle of why there's no dosage effect.
Fantastic, Ashu. It's super clear and super interesting. So thank you so much. You do have one question already in the chat. I don't know. I'll read it to you from Guangguo. How would you explain that similar programs in the U.S. tend to have much less long-lasting impact? Is that because they are at a very low base?
I don't know that there's a similar. What would the similar programs be? Because this is really just a no strings unconditional cash transfer, right? So maybe Sean can answer that. But my understanding is that Guang, that these two experiments now is going to answer this question, because those are genuinely no strings cash. These are UBIs, and so we'll see how they perform. Sean, I know, is raising her hand. Should I stop sharing, maybe? When I stop sharing, then I can see stuff. Okay. So Sean, please go ahead, and anyone else?
Just maybe following up a little bit on that, what I was wondering about was context, because sort of knowing Bangladesh and working there, that Bangladesh is a very different economic and social context to Zambia and Malawi. And I was just wondering, and I've also been looking at stuff on evaluation and bringing in context, and I wondered about how what kind of work is going on to look at how the sort of larger economic and social context interacts with these cash transfer programs and how they might work in different sort of developmental contexts.
I think that's super important. I think that in this case, one of our main explanations is that the context is so poor, right? That there's really not much that you can do aside from selling a little bit more product, and opening a little non-farm enterprise that's puny, but there's really not much. And so I think what we will see is in the next generation, as kids get more schooling and can migrate out, I think that's where you're going to really see like the transformational effect of these programs. But if you think about the typical 60-year-old female beneficiary, I mean, how is, like, what are the possibilities for her to move into the middle class? She can't read or write. She's tied to her land. So we're doing a little bit of work ourselves to try and identify these heterogeneous effects, to see who the high flyers are with a rich set of contextual information, to try and exactly do what you're saying, which is to identify what are the interactions with the context that might make folks be able to, generate high returns. That's super interesting. Okay, I'm looking at the chat, Bob. I'm trying to work this out here.
Okay, yeah. So Linda and then Sean. Yeah.
Okay. Linda, we've done a couple of deep dives in both the Zambia, I think, and the Malawi case, where we looked at everything, like the health inputs. I think that I don't know the answer. The ideas we have are that the disease environment is so brutal that it's hard to overcome that, and so the cash feeds into one pillar, which is like the food security pillar, but there's the caring pillar and the disease environment pillar, and it's not really moving indicators in those two areas. And so I think that for me would be the explanation, but you probably have some ideas on that, which would be interesting to hear. Sean, yeah, although I think people are tied. So Sean is saying, I assume everyone can read the chat. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, actually. I think most of these folks are not tied to the market, right? And so they're pretty isolated. So I'm not sure that would be an explanation, but it's definitely worth thinking about. Okay.
Yeah, Amber's got the next question there.
Amber is here. Who invited Amber? Oh my goodness. I'm so embarrassed now. Oh my God. Okay. Amber. Yeah, that's a great, that's definitely a hot item. So most of these programs have a sort of 3-year retargeting period. And when we did this, we did a sort of similar study in Zambia, where basically we did the same thing, where the delayed entry control group entered the program. That was a difference of about 4.5 years rather than the 2.5 or 3 years in Malawi. And we saw the same thing, complete catch-up. And in our dialogue with government around that, we brought up this exact point, which is that why bother retargeting after 3 years? Maybe give it 5 years, because these folks are ultra poor and they're just not going to leapfrog into the middle class in 3 years. So that's definitely, I think, a clear, actionable, thing that comes out of these results, right?
Ashu, I have a question about if there's any variability in transfer payments that could be exploited. So I get the $12, I think it's $12 equivalent per month or something like that, in very extremely poor households. And so you get these impressive effects, but long term it's hard to know. But have there been any experiments further, like I can think about, again, translating to the US case where payments might be much higher in Vermont and Maine versus Mississippi, or, and how, if any variability like that could be examined here, or if it's pretty flat across the context.
Yeah, there is the dimension that we've looked at. We've looked at two dimensions of that, and there's something else as well. There's one is the sort of intensity of the treatment. So looking at the share, the transfer share, the transfer as a share of your baseline consumption. And so there are two parts to that. One is the amount that you get based on your demographics, and then there's your baseline consumption. So you can imagine that if you are at that sweet spot where you have exactly 4 people, right, then you get the full transfer. And if you're particularly poor, then you get the full transfer and you're particularly poor, so the share is much higher. So like the intensity of the treatment is higher for those, whereas a household with 8 people, they still only get the cap of 4. And if they're a little richer, then that share is even lower. So we have looked at some of that. And in that article that I mentioned, we do find that the transfer share does make a difference in overall impacts. We haven't exploited that much further than that. But we've done that just as a way of reminding governments that the value of the transfer does matter, right? And that it makes a difference. So there are probably other ways that we can exploit that we should think about. Barbara, good to see you. Did you miss
No, I got your compliment, and I was also happy to see migration showing up on your slide.
Okay, I think you remember those results.
I do. Anyway, I really enjoyed the presentation, and in some ways my question's going to be fairly predictable given that we've worked together. But I am curious, I mean, you're following households over time, and one thing that happens when households are a little better off is sometimes they split into 2. And I wonder, if you think that's happening and how you think about that when you think about, the long run effects of these programs, especially.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that was towards the end, I didn't really, because I ran out of time, I didn't really talk about the current NIA grant. But what we're doing in that one is that we're now going to go back and find those youth that we initially interviewed who are age 13 to 19. And we went back to the households, we got the rosters. So we've looked at the rosters to see where those youth are. And about 70% of them have moved out. And so we're now going to follow them. So they've moved out to their own households. So that's the dimension that we've been looking at, the young folks who may move out and how the program may have set them up for a better transition. So that will be interesting to see.
Yeah, it will be. And how does the government think about the long-term impact of its program, on these units that are changing and splitting and all these other things? Is that part of their thought process or
no, that's part of the advocacy process on our side and UNICEF in particular to say, look, there are going to be these long-run effects. But, as we all know, the politicians have great myopia, even more than we do. And so that's a hard sell, but it's something that you keep. It's like the bicycle where you have to keep pedaling. But we feel like that's where there are going to be these big dividends. And there's some recent evidence. There's a paper that's just come out from the Mexican Progressa showing these 20-year results on the younger generation and showing that their grade attainment is higher, their wages are higher, right? So I think that's where we're really going in terms of trying to get governments to think longer term, but it's very hard. Yeah.
I want to stop here. It's 1 o'clock. Ashu, this has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, great to hear about this project and your both the good news and the struggles with it, and the new stuff that's coming down the road, and working with your team and so forth. It's just been wonderful. I do want to mention next week, Friday, November 19th is our last Friday seminar of the semester. It'll be Giovanna Merli from Duke University. We'll be presenting next week, so I'll look forward to seeing everyone then. And again, hope everybody has a good weekend. Thank you, Ashu. Hope you win your tennis tournament tonight and enjoy that. So really.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.